Okay, good evening and welcome, everyone, to the next installment of the BSO's Virtual Governing Members Lounge. I'm Allison Burr-Livingston. I am the BSO's Vice President of Development, and it is an honor to again come to you from my kitchen, this time with some pictures and ambience behind me, and to welcome other special guests for another great conversation. Again, our donor lounges, both at the Meyerhoff and at Strathmore, are places that are well known for hosting exclusive artist conversations. These are times when we need to make those conversations available not just to donors, but to the entire member of the BSO family. So that's what we're excited to do yet again. We are still live tonight, so before I introduce my guests, let me just remind everyone who's watching live about the P's and Q's of how to participate. If you are watching via the BSO's YouTube channel, you can enter a question for me or either one of our guests via the chat feature on YouTube that is being monitored. And for everyone else who's watching this on the BSO's offstage pages, you can go ahead and email your question to offstage, all one word, at bsomusic.org. And again, that is also actively being monitored. We're going to get to some questions from the audience at the end of the conversation. But first, let me introduce what tonight's conversation is all about and our guests. Tonight, we are going to be talking about all things orchestra and film, including a specific look at the classic film that was originally scheduled to be performed live with the BSO this weekend, The Wizard of Oz. I have the two best people to join me in a conversation about this. Todd Hitchcock, who is the Director of Programming at the American Film Institute's Silver Theater and Cultural Center in Silver Spring, which screens a dynamic combination of classic and contemporary films. Todd is clearly a well-rounded film aficionado. He has actually delivered some wonderful pre-concert lectures at Strathmore when we've done some other films. I think, Todd, you gave one around Amadeus, which was very well received. So we're excited to have you here tonight and also to learn a little bit more about what AFI is doing during these times to keep up connections. Also joined by another member of the BSO's musical family, Michael Ferraguto, who is the BSO's principal librarian. Michael, I think you joined the BSO in 2015.
Correct.
Is that about right? Previously, Michael held similar positions with the Alabama Symphony Orchestra, as well as fellowships with the New World Symphony and the Tanglewood Festival. He currently serves on the board of the Major Orchestra Librarians Association. And if you don't know what it means to be an orchestra librarian, I think you're going to learn a little bit more of that through tonight's conversation as well. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So why don't we, yeah, it's great. And as a reminder, anyone would like to join us with the cocktail, you're more than welcome to do so. Let's get into a little bit about the subject of The Wizard of Oz, and then I think we will transgress in our conversation accordingly. Todd, I want to kick it over to you to start. Obviously, The Wizard of Oz, it's a cult classic film. I think it was on Turner Classic Movies again earlier this week. I know I tuned in advance of this conversation. But the story was originally a book that I believe had a few forays into other forms of performance entertainment before becoming the movie that we all know and love. Can you tell us a little bit more about its history?
Sure, and I'll attempt to do this quickly, but there's a surprisingly long and twisty backstory to getting to the moment in 1939 when this classic movie musical comes into being. Most people are probably aware that it, as you said, started off as a book by a gentleman named L. Frank Baum. The L was for Lyman. He was born in a relatively small town in upstate New York called Chittenango. It's pretty close to Syracuse, New York. And Baum's first love, I would say, was the theater. He owned a theater at one point. He produced, acted, and wrote plays, but ultimately it wasn't successful. He tried his hand as a newspaperman for a number of years, and I think it was South Dakota. And he eventually ends up in Chicago with a growing family. And his next effort to be a provider is, I think he kind of sensed that there was an opportunity with children's literature. And he had modest success with kind of a Mother Goose type book, followed by a Father Goose. But then he hits a home run in 1900 with the publication of the book that you're seeing there in the beautiful first edition with the illustrations by W.W. Denslow, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And it's a blockbuster. It sells and sells. He makes real money for the first time in his life. And I think something of the serial entrepreneur really catches fire at this point. 2 years later, 1902, there's a stage play, a musical stage play in Chicago. And the next several images that we're cycling through here are images from that first stage version. It was a success. It played nearly 300 performances over the next year. It moves to Broadway. It's brought back in 1904. It tours the country. Now, one thing to point out, none of the music, it was a completely different set of songwriters and orchestrators. None of this music makes it into the 39 version. But now Baum is full franchisee. In 1904, he writes his second Oz book. He would go on to do 14 installments altogether, and eventually he's in a run where he's cranking out one a year. In 1905, he gives an interview and he says something that to me is fascinating. He says he's got his eye on an island off the coast of California and he wants to build an Oz amusement park. And if that sounds like a Walt Disney type vision to anyone else, it does to me. Of course, Disney was someone who was able to see that through many decades later. Of course, Baum had, no one knows what island he's talking about. He didn't actually have ownership of such a thing, but I just like the way that he's got that vision, the way he's thinking to put these things together. Also, 1905, this was right when Coney Island was becoming a thing. Luna Park had just opened a couple years before that and was hugely successful. 1908, he does this sort of multimedia thing where he combines a lecture and costumed players and film and slide background. And that there were other things like that at the time. That wasn't a completely original thing, but he's thinking about what medium to go into next. And in the early teens, 1914, 1915, he does in fact create his own movie production company. He moves from Chicago to Los Angeles, and for the next 2 years, he's dedicated to adapting. He's now got 9 books out in the Oz series, making his own films. These were thought lost for many years, although they have now been found. He ultimately made three titles based on those subsequent installments. They weren't particularly successful, though, and the company ultimately went under. That was not unusual at this time. Companies came and went very quickly in the teens in Los Angeles as what eventually became solidified as the studio system was coming into being. Unfortunately, Baum dies in 1919, so that's the end of his efforts to realize his vision. But that's not the last go-round of someone attempting a version of The Wizard of Oz in the silent era. A silent comedian named Larry Seaman makes a film in 1925, and this is not that well known. People who really know their silent films may be aware of it. There's a poster up about it now. And a couple things significant about this. First of all, it was not a success. It basically ruined Larry Seaman. He was successful as a silent comedian, short films in the teens, but by the 20s, that would have been kind of minor league. You're expected to graduate to features. That's where the business was. And people like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, they did have success graduating to features. Larry Seaman, not so much. There's a couple important things about this. One is that you may, well, no, if you can recognize him there in the Tin Man makeup, that's Oliver Hardy, one half of Laurel and Hardy. Other interesting thing about this, first of all, don't go in expecting anything that resembles the 39 movie, anything that resembles the books. The story is completely different. The field hands travel to Oz along with Dorothy. And it's not quite the same as the dual casting that we have in the 39 film. What's different in the 25 version, they disguise themselves once they're in Oz as those characters. But I do wonder if the screenwriters were familiar with this 25 version and mindful of that with what they ultimately did with 39. So end of the 20s, a very important thing happens in the film business, and that's, of course, the coming of sound. Very famously, The Jazz Singer in 27. It doesn't immediately happen, but by 1930, everything now is sound. And this is where, what do you do with sound? Well, musicals have a lot of appeal. So this is the first in vogue moment of movie musicals. And for a couple of years, they're really popular, and the various studios are doing them. but they're basically transpositions of stage shows and musical reviews and very stagey. And I think that probably contributed to them losing favor within just a couple of years. And throughout the coming decade, it's sort of on off how well musicals are doing. 1933, Warner Brothers hits upon sort of the next step in the evolution of musical with the Backstage musical. And they have a fantastic string of films: 42nd Street, Gold Diggers of 1933, and Footlight Parade. The Backstage musical marries a dramatic behind-the-scenes story to the rehearsal and production of the musical stage play that all of the actors and tech are putting together. Gold Diggers of 33, significant. The director is Mervyn LeRoy, who a few years later is the producer on The Wizard of Oz. So I think a key ingredient there's many ingredients, but a key one for what contributes to the version of Wizard of Oz working in 39 is that you've got this fantasy story, you've got this wonderful musical with wonderful songs, but neither one had to carry the whole load. They were able to partner together and balance out the effort of putting together this rich and rewarding story for the viewers.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that history and also sharing some really amazing images, especially for those who have seen the film and then can see some of the visual connections in the early interpretations from a performance and production element of the characters. Michael, I wanted to kick it over to you. Todd talked a lot about the components that went into the story and the creation of the story. When we get into now the 39 version with the capabilities of sound, and obviously, as Todd alluded to, a new score for this film, what makes the music of Wizard of Oz so memorable and really iconic across so many different generations?
Right. So one of the techniques that the composer utilizes is a technique called leitmotif, which is really just a fancy word for theme. So Dorothy has a theme, the witch has a theme, the lion has a theme. Anytime these characters come on the screen, they've got their own signature music, like a stamp, that can kind of change as the film goes on to depict their journey. So I wanted to look at two of those themes to show why this is so effective. So we start off with Over the Rainbow, which is Dorothy's theme. And we contrast that with Miss Gulch, or the Wicked Witch. Now, just listening to them, they're clearly absolutely opposite themes. And there's a couple musical reasons why there's such a great contrast. So if we go back to the image of Over the Rainbow, Dorothy's theme is characterized by these big intervals, like octaves and sixths. And it shows this kind of expansive, exploratory view of this character, is this long melodic line. Whereas the witch, all of her intervals are very tight together. They're all minor seconds. And just if you look at the musical phrase of it, they're completely opposite. So by the time you've heard both of these themes on screen, you instantly know that there's a conflict between these characters, and that even without any of the dialogue, you know that they are on opposite sides of the spectrum. And another thing too about the construction of these is that Dorothy's themes, with these, starting low and going high and coming back, mimics a rainbow physically. And this kind of more mimics the torrent of a tornado spinning around.
So interesting. Well, I pulled out this is the only hat that I have, and it's my daughter. So it doesn't really fit my head. But I thought it was very appropriate, and that's a wonderful example. And thank you not only for providing the musical example, but also the visual example, so everyone can see the scoring appropriately, so you can actually literally see the jumps when you're about those octave ranges within Dorothy's theme song, essentially with her leitmotif.
Yeah, and this technique didn't start with film. It started centuries before with music, and especially in opera, and in particular Wagner's operas. He had the ring cycle with these very, very long operas, but each character had their own theme. In particular, there's this evil dwarf named Alberic, who's got this theme that sounds like this. Which sounds a lot like the witch theme, right? It's this kind of offbeat kind of thing with these punctuated things. So, I'm sure that Herbert Stothard, who came up with the score, owed a lot to looking back to opera.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Did you have any other score examples you're sharing now, or maybe I should kick it over to Todd to talk a little bit more about one of the other icons of the film, thinking specifically about Dorothy when we're talking about her theme and thinking about Judy Garland?
Yeah, over to Todd.
Cool. So Todd, yeah, can you talk about, obviously this film really put Judy Garland on the map, right? Todd, I think you're on mute.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, good Zoom protocol for ensuring that Michael's keyboard can resound for all to hear.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem.
Right. So I had mentioned the many ingredients, and top of the list, Judy Garland, of course. She was 16 years old when she did this role, and she was MGM's top juvenile star at that moment in time, along with Mickey Rooney. But at that point, probably her biggest film, certainly the one that's the one pre-Oz one that people are familiar with now would be Love Finds Andy Hardy, one of the many Andy Hardy films. Oz really took her to another realm in terms of being a name above the title kind of star. And when you think back to her bigger films, they're after that in the 40s and 50s. But this project, this undertaking by MGM, I mean, it was such an ambitious thing. The budget, it went way over budget. $2.8 million, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot in terms of what movies cost to make now, but that would be much more than was typically spent on a big movie musical. That would have been more like 1.5 million. At the time, it was MGM's biggest expenditure on any movie, although that record didn't last very long because that same year they did Gone with the Wind, which was done for about $3.5 million. So I think where we are in the pictures now, yeah, okay. You can probably recognize that's Judy Garland and she looks like Dorothy, but the color's a little wonky, but that is in fact a blonde wig. So every movie's got a story of things that could have gone wrong, things that were hard to do, mistakes, missteps. This one's got more than its fair share. And it's a miracle that it all came together to make the movie that we all know and love. So in the early going, that's what Dorothy was going to look like. And of the 4 credited directors, George Cukor, one of the things that he can take credit for is he got rid of the blonde wig. And he went back to a more natural looking hair and also reduced the makeup. And he also, in coaching Garland, directing Garland, said, remember, you're supposed to be a little girl from Kansas, and that's the tone to set. It might sound like a small thing, but I think it was a huge thing in terms of playing what really is a difficult role. Frank Morgan, of course, the Wizard, and in Kansas, Professor Marvel. People who really know The Wizard of Oz already knows, but I'm assuming many people do not. He actually has 5 roles in the course of the movie, and there's a composite of 3 more. So various residents of the Emerald City, a carriage driver, and a guard, and a gatekeeper. That scene probably there's a whole bit with him back and forth with the Dorothy and the companions. So that one's got a little more screen time than the others. So Frank Morgan, probably the best known other film you could find him in, a great character actor in the 30s and 40s would be The Shop Around the Corner with Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan. And then the 3 companions, the 3 Kansas farmhands and companions in Oz, Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Bert Lahr. All 3 unsurprisingly, when you see their acting style and dancing skills, were great vaudevillians and Broadway stage actors. Burt Lahr probably has the fewest screen credits, and Bolger and Haley the most of the three. By far, for all three, this is the best known film that they're involved in.
Mhm.
Bolger can also be seen in The Great Ziegfeld from 1936, and interestingly, he plays himself as Ray Bolger vaudevillian for Ziegfeld, a name I'm going to come back around to in a little while. But an incredibly talented kind of specialty dancer with his rubbery limbs, which makes him a perfect, just a natural for the Scarecrow. But originally he was cast as the Tin Man. And now we're looking at the Tin Man, but if you look at that face, that is not Jack Haley. That is the second Tin Man, actually. So Bolger never made it to makeup before they moved him to Scarecrow. That's Buddy Epson, of course, best known as Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies in the 60s, but in the 30s, he was a character actor and dancer. He left the production early on, and this is a story that gets told. He had a terrible reaction to what sounds kind of dangerous, aluminum dust-based makeup. He was hospitalized for it. I mean, it was really serious. The production just had to go on, so Jack Haley was brought in as a emergency replacement, and that's how Jack Haley got in there.
Mm.
Burt Lahr, it's interesting to see his other roles because he's immediately recognizable as the guy who plays the Cowardly Lion. That's just his style of acting, very clownish. Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West, iconic, of course. Later in her life, people will remember the Maxwell House coffee commercials from the 70s where she played Cora, the Maxwell House lady. Well, she was not the original choice. First choice was Gail Sondergaard. And is that the first picture we saw of Gail Sondergaard as the witch? The similar
I think it's the first witch. Yeah, there's the second one.
Something important happens in 1938, and that's Walt Disney has his first feature animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which if you think what the evil queen looks like with that sort of snood wrap around the head, early on they were thinking that they were going to have that kind of dangerous, sexy witch, and they ultimately set it aside with how they depicted the Wicked Witch of the West closer to the book. And Sondergaard, who didn't really want to do it anyway, they said, well, okay, let's try to ugly her up. So that's a different makeup test. So they let Sondergaard go, and they said, Margaret, great news, you're going to be the Wicked Witch of the West. Of course, it's her greatest role.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Good Witch, Glinda, Billy Burke, a number of things I would like to share about Billy Burke. First of all, she was born in Washington, D.C. in 1884. So among Glinda's magical qualities, that's 55-year-old Billy Burke playing Glinda the Witch. She was born into a circus family who moves to London. That's where she, as a teen, begins acting on stage, comes to New York in her early 20s, starts in silent films in the late teens. She marries Florence Ziegfeld, that name again, the real Florence Ziegfeld, in 1921, and she retires from acting through the rest of the 20s. It's not until the stock market crash in 29 that she goes back to work. So she's in a second phase of her career. Ziegfeld sadly dies in the early 30s. Billy Burke continues on. That's a lovely picture of her as an actress in the teens. As a wonderful character actress in the 30s and 40s. Other movies that you can find her in: Dinner at 8, The Man Who Came to Dinner. She's in the Topper films. And if you can find it, a wonderful early 30s film called Only Yesterday.
Amazing. Thank you so much for those histories. Now, we're going to talk a little bit also about the songbook.
Yeah, I mentioned quickly George Cukor. There are 4 directors who worked on the film. Victor Fleming is the only one credited. He actually left before the film was completed because he got pulled over to replace George Cukor on Gone with the Wind. The history of these 2 iconic films from '39, very intertwined. A guy named King Vidor finished up. Long career, one of the greatest silent films, The Crowd. Vidor directs specifically the Kansas scenes, including the uber iconic Over the Rainbow scene. A guy named Richard Thorpe, kind of a journeyman director, was the first director on the film, but he only lasted a couple weeks before Cukor and then Fleming came on. The real constant is Mervyn LeRoy, who I mentioned before. When he was at Warner Bros. In the early 30s, he did a lot of gangster movies, Little Caesar. I Am a Fugitive from the Chain Gang, one of the great prison dramas. I mentioned Gold Diggers at 33 a little earlier. But then he becomes more of a producer at this point in the 30s. There were many, many, many screenwriters, so it's hard to give too much credit there. I would really say that the MVPs might be the songwriting team of Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg. They won, they shared an Oscar for Over the Rainbow. If you've heard the rumor that it was almost cut from the film, it's absolutely true. After the second preview, they took it out and then better heads prevailed and it was put back in. It's unthinkable not to have it in there.
Yeah.
Both of them had long songwriting careers outside of this film, but it's not taking anything away to say this is probably their best known work. Arlen wrote many songs with Johnny Mercer. He also wrote The Man That Got Away, which is probably Judy Garland's other signature movie song that was from A Star Is Born in the 50s. Harburg had many credits, including Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? April in Paris. Sadly, he was blacklisted for his political leanings in the 50s.
Well, I think that, Todd, I need to take you out to dinner so you can give me lots of other good intel about so many other films that I know I love. And I particularly love thinking about many of the other Judy Garland films. It really reminds me of what I grew up watching with my family. So thank you so much for sharing that. We talked a little bit, and you mentioned kind of the creation of the studios, and obviously this is an MGM production, an MGM musical. Michael, I think about part of the production aspect of a film, particularly something as monumental as an MGM musical, is the recording of the score. Can you talk to us about the way these big musical numbers were originally recorded?
Yeah, there's a really cool process that they came up with in this era where they would take the actual film strip and they would be able to mark the film strip in a certain way so that the live studio orchestra, the conductor, would be able to be looking down at his score, but also be able to see certain cues on screen at the same time. So what they would do is they would take the film strip and they would punch a hole in the middle of a certain frame so that when that frame came up, you would see a flash of light. And they could also do several frames in a row and you would kind of get a flicker effect. Or they would take a pencil and they would draw a diagonal line across the film strip. And then this would have the effect of a bar that moves side to side across the screen until it hits that flash. So that way the live orchestra would be playing, the conductor could look down at his score, his music, do what he needs to do, and have this kind of peripheral view of this flash that happens in the back. Now this kind of crept its way into its own kind of style of notation. So if we look at, for instance, Mozart's Don Giovanni, here, there we go. So this is what the traditional score looks like. But when we do it as a film with orchestra, when we did Amadeus, for instance, it looks a little bit different. So here you can see that the time signatures are really exaggerated. And there's also, some indications there for the conductor. Those X's are going to be a click that the conductor is going to hear in their ear, and those circles are the punches, those flashes of light that they're going to see on their particular video, so that they're able to coordinate things a little more easily with the orchestra, so that the exact frames land with the hits of the music. And if we keep going forward, there's, for instance, the actual notation for the orchestra changes too. So this is what it might look like if we're doing the Imperial March just on a normal concert. But if you advance one more, this is what the part looks like when we do film with orchestra. So again, you see the bigger time signatures. The note heads are actually bigger because they're going to be read either in low light, or the studio orchestras are going through things really quickly. They need to be able to sight read. They've got bar numbers on every single bar so that you can just jump right in. The title is more related to the cue and the reel than it is the actual, the scene in the movie. So it's really cool that, the movies have created a whole different kind of notation that was born out of this process.
When some of them, you call them clicks and punches and all of those. I remember you gave a great pre-concert lecture prior to Amadeus. So people who came to that really were in for the duration, because Amadeus is quite a feat of a film, certainly for the audience and for the orchestra. But I remember you showed some wonderful examples, even visually, of what it sounds like and what it looks like with the flash. So it's really quite an interesting process. And as you say, born out of this genre, which is really interesting to think about. I actually wanted to throw in a quick question that came in from an audience member named Jennifer. And I think it's appropriate what we were just talking about. She asked that when a musical such as Wizard of Oz is in production, how does that affect the timeline, since vocal songs will have to be completed prior to filming? So maybe that's an interesting one, and maybe Todd, you can join in on that as well if you have any thoughts on kind of the process and sequence of when the music production comes into the film production piece.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's post-synced. So, I mean, if you're looking closely, you can occasionally note how the mouths don't always match perfectly with the playback of the song. Yeah, there's several stages to making the film. The principal photography is just the one. All the sound is re-recorded and laid in.
Todd, I want to be able to have Michael talk a little bit about some of the other films that we're doing next season, get into a couple of other questions, but you've shared so much good information about the history and the making of The Wizard of Oz and all the stories behind it. Do you want to talk a little bit about just its legacy?
Sure. Well, I guess everyone listening, and presumably they know The Wizard of Oz. They've seen it over and over and over again over the years. And it's a weird film that it's both this incredibly mainstream established thing, but it still has this kind of cult classic, ultra passionate following to it. There's a rumor out there sometimes that, oh, well, it was a bomb at first, and it was a disaster, and it was only years later it made its money back. And that's one of those situations where it's kind of true. As I mentioned before, it was this hugely ambitious, hugely expensive production. It did not turn a profit right away. That took many years. There were re-releases of the films periodically through the 40s and 50s. But what really changed it was television. Starting in 1956, it had its first television airing. And then pretty much every year through the 60s, 70s, 80s, it aired more than any other title in the history of television to that point. And this is what really cultivated the devotion to this film, and the way it became this tradition for people, for families, for young kids to watch it. So by the time you get to the film's 50th anniversary in the late 80s, it's just this canonical established thing. But it took a while to get there. Ultimately became a hugely profitable film. But absent the secondary market of television and eventually video and cable, it might not have gotten there. Yeah. The pop cultural references are all over. We bump into them all the time. It's just one of the most canonical of classic Hollywood movies, at least for Americans. Outside of the country, maybe not as taken for granted.
Agreed. And I think, again, it was on just within the last couple of days. So the cycle continues. Obviously, we're sad that we weren't able to present it full live with orchestra this weekend, but it's not going to be the end. We will get back to business, and we will get back to, again, bringing back the magic of those films and those beautiful film scores in our concert halls. Michael, before we talk a little about what we are going to show next year, some questions have come in kind of thinking about why music is so important as a companion to film, and what do you both wish that the BSO would play with movies? What movies come to mind when you think that the music is particularly vital?
Well, I mean, right off the bat, any film scored by John Williams, you just know has such a deep and vibrant score, and it's just any film you see, if you strip out the music, it's not going to be nearly an emotional or exciting experience. But I personally get really excited for the John Williams movies, for the Star Wars films. One film that I would like to see us do that is now able to be released is Disney's put out the Muppet Christmas Carol, which is my favorite Christmas story, favorite telling of that tale. So I'm hoping that shows up on a future season. But I'm really excited that next year we're doing Toy Story, we're doing Psycho, which is a classic, and my favorite film score
Great
of all time.
strings in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're hoping to reschedule Empire Strikes Back, which to me is the greatest film score. So.
Yeah, great. Todd, what about you? What are your thoughts on, be they historical or more modern day, kind of that music and companion to film and things that work particularly well when you're thinking about putting the live orchestra in front of the production?
I mean, cinema, obviously I'm in love with the cinema. I get to do it as my job, but one thing if I had to identify what about it is so special to me, I love the way that it brings in all these other elements and music being one of them. I just want to pick up on something Michael said, that the Muppet Christmas Carol has really become one of our mainstays in the holiday season. It is a modern classic. People love that, and great music, great songs in that one as well. So these kind of conversations where we focus on the musical aspects of movies, something I particularly love. We've done a few retrospectives over the years that have focused on those aspects as well. You mentioned Psycho, of course, Bernard Herrmann and his, over the course of many movies, his partnership with Alfred Hitchcock. Again, one of those, if you remove the Herrmann music, it's not going to be the same. As great as Hitchcock is, it's not going to be the same thing. So really vital partnerships in these cases.
Yeah, agreed. Before we kind of close it out, because I am conscious of the time, Michael, maybe you could just expand a little 30-second. What does it mean to be a librarian for an orchestra? And how does your job change when you have to do some of the orchestra with film productions?
Sure, yeah. So the long and short of it is I have to get, anytime we perform music, which is every week, I've got to figure out where our sheet music's coming from, and I've got to make sure it's prepared in the right way so that what the conductor has matches what the orchestra has, and that we don't waste any time in rehearsal with, oh, I'm missing this bar, or I don't have this part, or whatever. If I do my job right, then the orchestra gets to rehearse and perform, and everything goes off without a hitch, and they really get into the music making. Now, because the BSO does so many different kinds of programs, we do classical, we do films, we do pops, we do opera, we do ballet, week to week. I kind of have to be an expert in all of that and know what conventions to follow and how to prepare all those different things. So movies tend to be, depending on the film, I mean, they present their own challenges, but some of them come and they're ready to go, and a lot of them need a lot of tweaking and a lot of coordination, and especially making sure that whatever markings are in there, like the bowings, are all matching for the orchestra, because we often get our fewest rehearsals for films because they're so long, and we have to get all of that music in one go.
Yeah. Now, actually, I feel like you mentioned that. I do need to read one other audience member question that came in. And this is from Alex, and they said that they had actually spoken with a musician who performed in one of these concerts, maybe a member of the orchestra or an extended member of the family, and said that working on a particular film score is easier when other orchestras have done the same score, because then those markings and what they learned because of the limited rehearsal time applies. And so would you agree with that? And that seems to make sense based on what you just said.
I mean, a lot of what I do is being a gatekeeper of, seeing the part and deciding what to take out and what to not take out. Yeah. And there's all kinds of, there's a language that evolves within, people's parts that I know, oh, this is not helpful or this is helpful. So it's a lot of those kind of judgment calls.
Great. Well, I'm sure that if anyone has any other specific questions, either for Todd or Michael, if they want to send it to the offstage email address, you both are encyclopedia of knowledge and interesting information that people could really dive into a lot of detail. And I know we'd be happy to pass along those questions to you. But in the interim, I want to just maybe leave it with Michael. What else are you particularly excited about next season? And Todd, what else is AFI doing right now, and how can people stay connected with you in that institution, particularly if they're film lovers, even during this time of virtual connections?
Right.
Michael, why don't you start, and then we'll end with Todd.
Well, yeah, I'll highlight the movies we're doing, because I really do think they're a lot of fun. Toy Story, I think, is the first one. And I remember being a kid, seeing that movie in theaters and really being enthralled. And it's funny, Randy Newman did the score for that. And his father, I think, was Alfred Newman, who was the one who came up with the streamers and punches. So there's this kind of musical legacy
Little connections, yeah.
that goes through there. And again, like you said, there's Psycho, and we're hoping to get the continue the
We'll figure out all the
Harry Potter films, and it just brings all kinds of people into the hall, and it's just so much fun.
Great, thank you for that. I know I'm looking forward to a lot of those as well. And Todd, how else is AFI keeping connected during these times? What else can people look forward to?
Well, with the challenge of the theater is closed right now, we were very fortunate in that some of the great indie art house distributors in the US stepped up really fast and created this opportunity for us to still have some sort of presence. So all of a sudden we have a streaming channel, a virtual screening room, and we've been presenting since March 27th. We've been presenting various films available for streaming at home. You can see everything on our website, afi.com/silver. We've been premiering 4 or 5 a week. And at the moment, opening Friday, we have a terrific documentary called Other Music about a really special, beloved record store in New York City. Another doc about bookstores and book selling called The Booksellers. We've got the Internet Cat Video Festival, which was our big hit last week. We've got a new documentary called The Dog Docs. We've got cats, we've got dogs, we've got books, we've got music.
It's a success. What more could you ask for?
What you need to get through this time.
Definitely. Well, thank you both for joining me this evening. It's really been a pleasure. I truly appreciate it. And for everyone else, thank you for tuning in. Please join me next Thursday, again at 5 o'clock, where we are going to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Hubble telescope. So stay tuned to learn more. And in the interim, cheers. Thank you. Bye.
Yes, thanks.